Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I want to share my 5 favorite Argentine novels, and I've been working on this for months, back since like May when I did the top 5 English novels video. But as I've been compiling, revising my list, I realized there are more than 5 Argentine writers I'd like to discuss, in part because Argentina has produced some world-class short story writers. Writers whose stories are provocative, they are fascinating. They merit not only reading, but rereading and close rereading the same way that great novels do. So I want to do a video just talking about some of my absolute favorite Argentine writers. And then at the end, give a list of my top 5 novels. And it should be noted that I need to read the novels and most of the longer short stories in an English translation. My Spanish is strong enough to be able to sort of do translation in my head when I'm reading poetry or short pieces. But for the novels, I have to read it in an English translation. I still, however, find so much to appreciate, so much to love in Argentine literature, and I hope that you do too. So let's kick it off with a writer who sort of kicks off Argentine literature, and that's Esteban Echeverria, who wrote El Matador, sometimes translated as The Slaughterhouse, sometimes as The Slaughter Yard, in the late 1830s, possibly in the 1840s. It's not entirely clear. But it is a very powerful, it is a visceral story. I'm going to include a link to a translation, an English language translation, in the description box below, and I'd really encourage folks to check it out. El Matador is set during an early Argentine civil war. It is in Buenosayres during Lent, and they're running out of meat. And folks who are used to being able to have that are starting to get frustrated. There's this tension. But that's this tension that's overlaying the actual social political conflict during that civil war between the Unitarians and the Federalistas. And that is what sort of bursts onto the scene of the story. The violence that explodes within the story is generated as a combination of the social conflict and that very personal, like in the moment craving conflict. It is a visceral story with actual like viscera, not human. But again, it is a powerful story, and Echeverria was essentially writing from exile at a certain point in his life, and we'll see that with other writers that I'm going to discuss in this video. But his story is very powerful, and it reminds me as a reader of the best stories from Stephen Crane, particularly works like Blue Hotel, where there is this very obvious sense of tension right from the beginning, and the way that the worst aspects of human nature are revealed and then almost sidestepped and dismissed at times is very authentic, even when it feels disappointing in human nature. So Esteban Echeverria, El Matador, just a wonderful story to explore. Jumping forward, I would like to just briefly mention someone on the other end of the spectrum from Argentine literature. If Echeverria kicks it off, one of the great writers working right now is, of course, Mariana Enriquez. And she is a writer of short stories, and I've read both of her collections. I think I slightly prefer Dangers of Smoking in Bed more than Things We Lost in the Fire, but they're both very strong. And I would say with her that feels like she's writing horror stories, and they are horrifying in many ways. They're very emotional stories as well. There is a darkness that she taps into, and she taps into very easily. However, the Dangers of Smoking in Bed is in some ways a story of wonder as much as it's a story of darkness. And I think that is what keeps me very interested in where Enriquez will go in her future career as a writer, is her ability to not only see the horror and see the darkness, but to see the pinpoints of light that exist, the pinpoints of wonder that can exist within a life that feels consumed by darkness at times. So I would encourage you to check out either of her short story collections as well. Another writer who comes to mind, and one whose work is not going to be one of my top 5 favorite novels, but it's certainly an influential work, would be Adolfo Bioy Casares, who wrote The Invention of Morel. This is the only work of his I've read. It is strange, it is fascinating, it is goofy at times. It was a huge influence on the French film last year, Mariana. And the picture of Louis Brooks on the cover is sort of a nod towards a character or a writer's fascination who's saying, but it is a strange, beautiful little book. I don't want to give too much away because it's so short and it's very enjoyable to dip into. But Alfredo Bioy Casares was married to another one of the great Argentine short story writers, Silvina Ocampo. And I don't have her collection, Thus Were Their Faces, published by NYRB Classics here behind me. But if I was going to recommend one of her stories, I would recommend The Imposter. I think it's a very powerful story again. It is, again, a dark story that might be a theme across a number of these books I'd like to discuss. But it is a real masterpiece. It is a gem of a story. And she wrote numerous works. I'm hoping that more and more of her works will continue to be translated and published or republished, throughout the world, because her voice and her sensibilities are really quite something quite wonderful. Moving forward, I'd like to talk a little bit about Roberto Arlt. And he wrote two just absolutely, knock on the door classics. One is The Seven Madmen, which is fantastic. And then sequel, The Flamethrowers. And these were written this was in the late 1920s, Flamethrowers in the early 1930s. These are really, really great books to read. And we'll be talking more about this shortly. But continuing to move forward, we have a writer like Julio Cortázar. And Cortázar is famous in some quarters for his novel Hopscotch, and others for his just incredible short stories. Blow Up was filmed by Michelangelo Antonioni. It is not, however, my favorite of Cortázar's stories. That is, it's not House Taken Over, although I did a video on House Taken Over, which I had a lot of fun doing. I'll link that in the description box, but I think I almost need to do a video on Continuity of Parks, maybe in the next week or next month, because Continuity of Parks is wonderful. It is something that feels ahead of its time. It is something that continues to surprise readers now, even after all of the different ways we've seen not only fiction, but film and the different ways that we've been subverted. Continuity of Parks continues to subvert readers and our expectations marvelously. Cortázar is one of my favorite writers. He, again, sort of lived as an exile from Argentina. He, when Perón came to power in the 1940s, there are writers who stayed, there are writers who left, there are writers who went elsewhere in South America or Central America, some went to Europe. And so Cortázar ultimately lived in Europe for most of the rest of his adult life. But he produced stories that draw on his life in Argentina. And House Taken Over is a story that really gets at the danger that arose when people were just disappearing and their possessions would disappear. And Cortázar understood that and expressed that very acutely in his stories. Hopscotch is a fascinating book. It's a book that can be read either, page 1 to page 300, or you can follow the little notation at the bottom of chapters and skip between chapters, and you get two different novel experiences. It feels a little artificial at times. I think he's much stronger as a short story writer, but he's, again, one of my favorites. And another writer, who I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, is Antonio Di Benedetto. My favorite of his novels is Zama, and we'll talk more about this in the near future. But he also wrote a couple of other books. I've got the Silentiary to read hopefully later in January. And he was writing in the 1950s, 1960s. He was someone who sort of had seen the end of Perón's power, and then saw what happened when the military junta came to power. And he was actually arrested, he was tortured, and ultimately was able to flee. But this is a writer who grasped what was possible in the darkest times, even before he experienced what was possible in the darkest times. And that prescience is very interesting as a writer. But we'll talk more about Zama very soon. Sort of right as Di Benedetto was at the end of his career and of his life, we have Manuel Puig, whose Kiss of the Spider Woman comes out in the late 1970s. And Puig has a number of books that are interesting. One of the things that's really interesting about Manuel Puig as a writer is the way that he is fascinated with film, that he has his characters fascinated with film. It feels somewhat comparable to what's happening in the marvelous step, that link from Invention of Morel to works like Kiss of the Spider Woman and a couple of other novels from Puig. But he was writing in the 1970s, 1980s, and introduces us to characters that perhaps we haven't seen in previous works from Argentina. Moving then into more recent years, we have just absolute great writers, many of them being published now in translation by Charco Press. So writers like Ariana Harwitz, who grew up in Argentina and continues to stage plays in Argentina, even if while also living in France, and Die My Love. Or Ricardo Romero, who's the president's room, recalls Cortázar's house taken over and updates it in some ways. There are writers like Gabriela Cabezon Camara with The Adventures of China Iron and Slum Virgin, and Selva Almada with The Wind That Lays Waste, Dead Girls. And so those are some of my favorites. The absolute all-time number one favorite, though, among all of my Argentine writers must be, although I hope maybe one of these current writers will surpass this person, but right now it is still Jorge Luis Borges. His short stories are a marvel. There are so many of them to appreciate. I sometimes consider his stories as this universe that is a hall of mirrors, and then someone throws a brick through it, and each sliver of the mirrors that are shattered becomes a story by Jorge Luis Borges. And that strange hall of mirrors sensibility of what are we seeing around that corner? Where are we? What's happening? What's happening within the story? What's happening to the characters? What's happening to us as readers? All of that combines in these short micro bursts to just fascinate and delight me as a reader. Stories like The Library of Babel, The House of Asterion, The Aleph, of course, but I don't know, within this season, perhaps The Gospel According to Mark. If you've read that one, you know what I mean. But Jorge Luis Borges, I just absolutely love his stories. I've read many of his poems too, and his essays, but his stories are what I return to more and more. Other writers who I've read some but not a huge amount from would include Ricardo Piglia with the Diaries of Emilio Renzi, who is sort of this alter ego of his who lives throughout the same lifespans of many of these writers throughout sort of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s. These are, again, almost like Cortázar's hopscotch. They feel artificial at times. They feel novel and interesting as a novelty rather than as something to really enjoy. But he's a writer some folks might really tap into. So if Borges is my single favorite writer, what are my 5 favorite novels? Well, let's take a look at some of these. And I'm going to return us to The 7 Madmen by Roberto Arlt, because this book is fantastic. It is a book that looks back 10 years after the Russian Revolution at the rise of the strongman. We have a character here, the astrologer, who has brought various characters in Buenos Aires under his sway. And various things ensue from there. There are ideas in here that feel very close to what Orwell would do a decade later with Animal Farm. There are ideas that feel prescient in terms of recognizing what will be happening in South and Central America as individuals who are political leaders who are influenced by the Russian Revolution do rise to power or attempt to take power. And what the ramifications, positive or negative, are of those attempts. And so Roberto Arlt is tapping into so many moments and yet almost projecting onto what's going to be happening in the future there in the Western Hemisphere. And so it's fascinating to read this with our current historical perspective and to see what he could understand and how he could expand that, how he could extrapolate that. But the writing is also just very strong. It is a very thrilling, interesting, good book. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. I hope more folks read it. And I don't believe NYRB Classics has an edition of the Flamethrowers, but perhaps that will be coming out soon. Nevertheless, this was an enormous influence. It was an enormous influence on Cortázar, on Borges, on the next writer we're going to talk about. Because I'm kind of doing this in a chronological order. So the next Argentine novel I identify as one of my 5 favorites is this monster, Adam Buenosayres. Sometimes in Spanish it's Adán Buenosayres, by Leopoldo Marechal. And this is a writer who stayed in Argentina after Perón came to power. And that was something that some writers who had family members disappear never really forgave him for. And Marechal felt that he was trying to do something with this book. He spent nearly 2 decades writing this book in fits and starts. He was deeply influenced not only from Argentina, but from European literature. And there are ways in which he was dismissed as trying to create sort of an Argentine portrait of the artist as a young man. Sometimes it's Argentine Ulysses, because this is a massive 600-page novel that takes place over 3 days in the life of Buenosayres. What old last name. But we see his experiences, and then we open with a prologue that's almost something from like Nabokov, where the writer says, we're burying my friend Buenosayres today, but I found this manuscript, but before I give you his manuscripts and his notebooks, you won't understand them unless I tell you about his life. And so we get 300-something pages of the life of Buenosayres. And then we get about 50 pages of his notebooks. And then we get another 250 pages of this strange, horrifying, obsessive journey that is Dante-esque, very intentionally Dante-esque. And it all works on multiple levels. This is a translation from Norman Cheadle, but this is a book that I think readers who enjoy sort of postmodern fiction, maximalist fiction, unconventional fiction, would really, really just dive into this and enjoy it. There's a sense of real truth to reality in the way he casts characters, and sort of, instead of saying like, oh, any resemblance to real life characters is not coincidental, that's what I was going for right at the beginning. He himself is one of the characters, but it doesn't feel too close to autofiction. It doesn't feel overly like narcissistic. It's more someone who's trying to have a little bit of fun. It's not quite as serious as James Joyce is in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, so I'd recommend Buenosayres as my second favorite Argentine novel. I'm doing these roughly chronologically. So up next we have Zama by Antonio Di Benedetto. This was published in 1956, and I read this right before I started my booktube channel, and I really ought to reread it and do a full review of it, because this is a book that is just fantastic. Readers who enjoy Cormac McCarthy's books, I would recommend. This is an Argentine novel to explore. We're in the 18th century with Don Diego de Zama, who really yearns to be successful. He has his eye on the brass ring of success, and a great posting that the governor will, and the viceroy will recognize him. However, he's out at Asuncion, which is now, of course, the capital of Paraguay, but at the time was sort of the frontier of the Spanish colony there. And he is tasked with various things, and he is a failure. He's a failure as a functionary. He is a failure as a parent, as a lover, as just a human. And Di Benedetto has this sort of jaundiced, cynical view. And yet there are all these glimmers of humanity that he makes sure that he imbues in this character of Zama, and that we as readers get to spend time with. We get to spend time with the human behind all of these failures, and to start to appreciate that human. But the ending of the novel is where it really, as I said, sort of goes towards that space that Cormac McCarthy likes to explore, where they go off to basically track some bandits deeper and deeper and deeper into the frontier. And I won't spoil the ending, but I'll simply say that once you've read this, just remember it was written about 30 years before Blood Meridian. And this is one of my 5 favorite Argentine novels. And then we'll go into Kiss of the Spider Woman. This is a beautiful book. It is a book that is about so many different things. It is a book about friendship between 2 men who seemingly have nothing in common. It is written in the aftermath of the real-life military junta there in Argentina. It was published in 1978 or 1979. And so we have a pair of characters in a prison there together. It is a prison book. One of them is a hairstylist who's gay, as Puig was himself. The other is a political, prisoner. He's a political prisoner. And so 2 men who are there for very different reasons, seemingly, I think nowadays we could recognize how both Valentina and Melina are both political prisoners in a very real sense. And yet at the time that was not clear to so many readers and to the audience. And Puig is kind of drawing those and showing that two prisoners who seem to be there for very different reasons and seem to be very different men. Their motivations are different. Their passions are different. The way that their friendship grows, the way that they begin to appreciate and respect each other, the way that Puig uses the dignity of the exile and of the political prisoner to give dignity to the gay character is truly wonderful. It is incredibly humanizing in a very real way, similar to what Ursula K. Le Guin does, where she takes characters that seem to not be human as some type of alien, and then shows the humanity that exists within them, and tries to get us to try and recognize that humanity in each other. And so this is a wonderful book. There was an adaptation in the 1980s with William Hurt and Raul Julia, I believe. That's good, but the book is stronger. Molina, the Kiss of the Spider Woman within the title, Molina is obsessed with film. As I mentioned, there was a connection to the Invention of Morel. He's obsessed with film, and so he will spend his days in prison at times just telling stories of the movies. He essentially narrates movies to Valentin, who of course is very focused on what's happening to those my comrades, what's happening to the people I was with, what will happen to me, what is happening. I have a role to play in this world and in this society, in this time, and I'm trapped here. And the sacrifices ultimately that they are each willing to make for each other, again, just makes this a really wonderful book to spend time with. It is, again, sort of unconventional, sort of experimental, the way that we get the film narrations that at times seem to be totally separate, and yet the ways that Puig draws little links in is quite wonderful. All right, continuing to move forward, that was number 4. Number 5 would be a fairly recent book, and that is The Adventures of China Iron by Gabriela Cabezon Camara. This book is written with a deep intertextuality with the great gaucho epic of Argentina, Martin Fierro. There was a generation of writers who called themselves Martin Fieristas or Martin Fierros or something like that, where they took the character's name. And that is a long poem, a gaucho epic, written by Jose Hernandez in the 19th century. What Gabriela Cabezon Camara does is she takes that poem and she takes a little bit character, China Iron, the supposed wife of the great gaucho Martin, who has gone off as a gaucho, and she tells China's story. And it is this wonderful, intoxicating story. We see, again, the development of Argentina as this national identity that is being cultivated in different places. We see the influx of immigrants from the Americas, from Europe, into Argentina, and what that was like. That is a very real thing that happened in the 19th century. And so we see all of those things, but the language, the way that Cabezon Camara is constantly subverting readers, the way that she is allowing us into characters who often not only lived at that time, but were a very real part of it, and yet their voices never pop up in these poems or in these novels or stories from that time. The way that she gives those characters voices and lets us into their thoughts is something to behold. I really, really enjoyed this book. My wife really enjoyed this book, and I look forward to reading everything I can from this writer. And so those would be my 5 favorite novels. I have one more I want to mention, because I don't know that it's quite a novel. It's sort of journalistic fiction. But I think it's the single best book I've ever read from Argentina, and that is Dead Girls from Selva Almada. I identified this as sort of the best nonfiction, fiction hybrid. It's hard to tell how to classify this. If we were calling it a novel, it would be on my list of 5 favorite novels. I think this is an essential book for reading. It is a book that responds to so many ideas that Roberto Bolaño was pushing at in his 2666. It is a book where Almada really examines what is it like to be a member of a society where women can be killed and nothing can be done about it, where femicide is common, where young, teenage girls or young women or older women who are her same age at different times in her life have disappeared or been murdered. And how could that have been her? What are the times that she's trying to investigate something, trying to uncover something where she suddenly realizes her own life could be in danger? And so to read that, I think this is, as I said, the greatest book I've read from Argentina itself. But those were my favorite novels from Argentina. And again, the single most essential book I've read from Argentina. But I'd be curious to know what yours are. I know there are so many I'm missing. So I'd love to dive in and continue reading more from Argentina, and please share your thoughts. So again, I hope everyone is well.